we got to the final talk of the day, which unfortunately is me. And I think quite a lot of the slides or bits of the slides you're going to see, and some of the things I talk about have been covered already today or yesterday. So hopefully we can skip over a lot of that. I mean, I decided to call this Fame at 50, How Mature is Archaeological Business? And I think one measure of our maturity is judging last night after we'd finished the drinking out in the courtyard there, of not going to the Black Swan for that extra pint, and therefore feeling this morning a lot better than I usually do at most Fame conferences. So that is a measure of maturity, but we need to see how we measure archaeological business and its maturity, I think. So this is going to be two parts, really, this talk. The first part is a history. So it's just trying to talk about the origins of Fame and its predecessors and the context of that, some of which you've already heard. And then working through the decades a little bit until we come to the last 15 or so years since Fame was created, a bit over 15 years, and to see some of the achievements that we've managed to make in that period, and finishing off with an analysis of where we are. So a slightly different logo from the one you've seen before, Fame at 50 on this one. But to look at the rescue image again, the context in which we started was one of post-war reconstruction. So you had the CBA created in 1948, and you had budgets created by the Inspectorate of Ancient Monuments in the 1950s to help ostensibly in excavation and understanding the archaeological remains that were either bomb damaged or more appropriately, or not appropriately, but worse, affected by replanning and the destruction that occurred during all the town planning that went on in the 50s, 60s and 70s. And this funding was arranged in a geographic way, with units, research committees and units of archaeologists set up. And so block grants were made available in the 1970s to make sure that the organisation could continue. That was largely out of the fact that in 1971, a group of many members of the public, but also a group of archaeologists led by Philip Ratz, amongst others, protested and formed the British Trust for Archaeology Rescue, not only, but largely because of this road accident that you can see here. A lorry drove into the Roman Arch in Lincoln, and they were going to pull it down because it was an obstacle. It is still there, as you can see in the small photograph. And that was very much a consequence of public action, because the public supported archaeology. And in the 70s and 80s, of course, we had a lot of volunteer and amateur archaeologists who were very, very good. And they often managed to get their school children involved because they were often school teachers themselves. A situation that perhaps we don't have these days. However, in 1979, the Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Areas Act, although it brought in some very good things, brought in a change to that funding, and it made it, they changed their funding basically to project funding rather than to supporting the core part of these units. So during the 1970s, there were a lot of young people, young archaeologists, who had suddenly found themselves thrust into the position of directing teams of archaeologists and interfacing with politicians and construction people and all sorts of others. And they realized they had a whole series of different challenges that they needed to resolve. And so they created an organization to discuss professionalism, paying conditions, and other issues, and also to be the representatives to meet with government and their representatives. And they published some wages and ways of best practice with different types of industrial sector. And they decided to call themselves, because they were young and wanted to be a little bit disparaging, the Standing Conference of Unit Managers, SCUM, very deliberately SCUM, because that's what developers tend to call archaeologists at the time. Peter Adaman, who is not here now, but he was here earlier, was the first chair, and Tom Hassel was the second chair. And when I was trying to get the background to all of this, Tom actually came back and gave me a very useful document, which I'm going to read out here. He says, here are some, as promised, there are a few random thoughts, which I hope do not suffer too much from forced memory syndrome. In the early 70s, the organisational face of British archaeology was changing rapidly. In the 60s, professional excavations were directed largely by professional archaeologists who were employed by local authority museums and a growing number of university departments. There was also a proliferation of excavation committees established to carry out excavations in response to specific development threats. Some local amateur societies were also active in the field. In Oxfordshire, for example, the Ashmolean Museum staff sometimes excavated, and then the newly formed County Museum Service had an archaeological department. The Oxford University Archaeological Society was the main outlet for undergraduate archaeologists. Meanwhile, an Upper Thames Archaeological Committee dealt with sites being destroyed by gravel extraction. In Oxford in 1967, another excavation committee was established, and I was appointed as a full-time director of excavations to lead the excavations in advance of the city's redevelopment programme. This appointment was arguably the first appointment of its kind in the country. Most of the actual excavations were carried out by volunteers, usually in university vacations. In 1968, Martin Biddle established the full-time Winchester Archaeological Unit. The word unit was then the fashionable term for a research organisation, but the name was then taken up by archaeologists elsewhere. For example, in 1972, the Norfolk Archaeological Unit was established within the local authority museum service. The York Archaeological Trust was established in the same year. In February 1973, the Department of the Environment called a meeting of concerned archaeological organisations, such as the CBA, local authority museum and excavation committees, to discuss a future national framework for archaeology. The Department of Environment indicated that the whole country was going to be divided into 15 multi-county archaeological units, each with a director, a number of field archaeologists, and an overall budget of just under £1 million, which at the time seemed astronomical. This amount was, however, far short of the sum that would actually have been required. However, after months of discussion, this archaeological Camelot was abandoned in favour of the encouragement of county-based units. Accordingly, in 1973 in Oxfordshire, the various excavation committees all came together to form the Oxfordshire Archaeological Unit. Unlike, say, Norfolk, the OAU was not part of the local authority, but an independent educational charity, like Winchester or York. Funding was a major issue, but certainly in the case of Oxfordshire, a core grant was given by the Department of the Environment, with other funds coming from grant-giving organisations and a commercial sponsor. Core funding of the growing number of units began to overwhelm the funding available from DOE, which later had to abandon the concept of core funding in favour of project funding. Funding of the units always posed real problems, which were in part alleviated from 1974 by Manpower Services Commission schemes for providing jobs for the unemployed. In the case of Oxfordshire, funding from within the county could not sustain the organisation, so that soon the unit began to take on projects outside of the county. It accordingly changed its name to the Oxford Archaeological Unit, later changed to Oxford Archaeology, to reflect its wider geographical area of operations. The directors of the growing number of archaeological units realised that they had many management problems in common, such as funding, pay scales, contracts, conditions, pensions, etc. Little or no guidance came from the DOE. The directors of units began to meet informally, and then, as certainly used to be the usual way of archaeologists at the time, they decided to meet on a regular basis and to form a sort of archaeological employers organisation to share experiences. Since there was a definite feeling at the time that DOE was not providing either sufficient finance or general support to units, the Standing Conference of Unit Managers was born, and its deliberately ironic acronym of SCUM. In the 1980s, of course, things started to change. We'd already had the formation of various different units around based out in cities and local council units. And according to Andrew Lawson's paper in John Hunter and Ian Ralston's book on archaeological resource management in the UK, the Institute for Archaeologists, for Field Archaeologists, was formed in 1982. I don't know whether Kate and Pete and Rob would actually agree with that, but that's what it says in the book, 1982. Yeah. In 1983, the Inspector of Ancient Monuments became the Historic Buildings and Monuments Commission, called English Heritage. SCUM changed its name to SCORM because there was a conference in 1995 where a majority of those attending decided they needed to be more professional, seemed to be more professional by those they were dealing with, the developers. And so the insertion of that A, the archaeological, the Standing Conference of Archaeological Unit Managers, was important. I believe that Peter Adamant and Tom Hassel both voted against it. It was also in the 1980s, the first edition of the Health and Safety, as Luke talked about. Health and Safety in Field Archaeology was published by J.L. Allen, and that has been refreshed several times. And the graph at the bottom of this slide is just a little reflection of the input, the output of central funding, which is the kind of mid-grey on that. The increase in local council funding, which is the lighter colour at the top of the bar charts. And then that darker colour in the centre is manpower services. So you can see there was quite a pickup when there was the central government funding was dropping off of the manpower services, and then local council units started taking over. And here we have one, Worcester. And in this, you might notice 3 people: Adrian Tyndall, opening the bottle of champagne; Malcolm Cooper. So both Adrian and Malcolm have been previous CEOs of FAME. And then Robin Jackson, who is presently on the board of FAME. And obviously in those times, there was a shift you can see in this sort of developing professional world in the 1980s. There are some people with hard hats on. So health and safety has been taken seriously. No PPE, but there are hard hats. So we then during the 1980s, the Local Government Act, which separated enabler and provider roles. At the time, that perhaps didn't seem very significant, but that became particularly significant with the advent of the 90s. And you can see on that chart the growth in funding for archaeology. 7 million by the end of, that starts off in 1972, ends in the 1990, and at that point, EH was putting about 7 million in, and developer funding was already putting in about 14 million. So that shift to archaeology being publicly funded into being privately funded was already happening before the 1990s. But then in 1989, we had the Rose Theatre, and again, a big public outcry, obviously led by very prominent people, actors, who wanted to see that preserved. And it is still preserved, although nobody can really see it, and nobody quite knows how well preserved it is because it's under a lot of sand, and it's just monitored by Historic England. Nonetheless, it formed the basis for what came next. A new world, a brave new world of competitive tendering. And again, this situation of the 1990 PPG 16, the polluter pays philosophy, led to a whole lot of young people, young archaeologists, suddenly being landed with this situation of not just doing archaeology, which they'd been employed to do, but then they had to take on a whole series of different roles. They had to understand financing and costing up projects and what contracts meant, and how you actually interface with developers and planning process and all sorts of different things. And so obviously in the 1990s, there was a lot of contention because these locally based units, which had invested time, resources into understanding their local area and had expertise in it, were suddenly exposed to national organizations or people moving nationally across boundaries which had previously existed. And therefore there was all this thing, are you costing correctly? How many people, have you got core funding from some local council or university? Therefore, is it a level playing field? What are the quality sides of it? Is the quality being lost? And so the chairs of fame at the time, firstly John Walker and then Dave Jennings, were part of the teams that tried to address this. And we have the SCORM publication on guidance and notes for competitive tendering for archaeological services. And that was the first attempt to try and have a standard there that everybody should be working towards. The SCORM health and safety manuals continued to be important and continued to be, I'm sorry, I said that John Walker and Dave Jennings were chairs, and they weren't. They were chairs in the early 20s. It was Brian Ayres who was mostly chairman in the 1990s. And so by the time of the late 90s, we had information being sought about what now comprised archaeology in the UK, profiling the profession, which came up with the fact that there were 1,500 archaeologists in commercial work at that time, out of 4,425. So if we look back to what Kenneth was saying earlier, there's quite a growth in archaeologists. SCORM also produced a guidance note on archaeology and employment. And it had 7 principles, which were very largely based on those of the IFA. In the beginning of this millennium, we had a little bit of a point at which SCORM got into the doldrums. It did have reserves. It was charging very little. It had a mixture of different people who were involved in different parts of archaeology and partner organizations. And it had lost its way a little bit. We had articles being published, as already mentioned. Pete and Dave's article on quality in archaeology, which identified the fact that it was a buyer's market. The clients had too much power, developers had too much power. There were too many providers out there, and there weren't any entry barriers. Anybody could be an archaeologist. And then we had the financial crash. So with that internal debate in SCORM about who should be members, can we actually run an efficient professional organization just with people giving up some of their time to do that who are on the board? What is it that we actually wanted to pursue in terms of quality and market conditions? How should we develop it? It was decided after Dave Jennings, he handed over to Roland Smith and Roland, and decided that we should rebrand ourselves as the Federation of Archaeological Managers and Employers, and focus ourselves entirely on commercial practice. And at the same time, he said that if we actually wanted to achieve anything, we needed to use the reserves that had been built up and put it into employing an executive officer, so that we relieve that burden on those who didn't have the time, who were sitting on the board. And so Adrian Tyndall was appointed as the first director. The first chief executive. So part 2 is talking really about what's happened since then, what FAME has achieved, or what we all have achieved, and FAME has tried to help each and every one of you as an archaeological organization and do that. And just a few little images up there. The one on the top left is the Which Archaeologist, a guide to the procurement for archaeological services, which is available on the FAME website, and it's about 8 pages long or so, and it is supposed to be there for clients to make informed decisions about who they want to employ and why, because it's not just about cost, as we all know, it's about other aspects. And different clients have different reasons for taking someone on. Sometimes they're just, is this a partner organization? Have they got the same quality standards that we have? Are they doing ISO 9001, for example? It could be we're really interested in bringing the local community on board as well. Therefore, let's use the local unit. It could be we like Cambridge Archaeological Unit because they're part of Cambridge University. Therefore, we want high profile. So there are all sorts of different reasons why someone might choose to appoint a different archaeological contractor. I hate that word contractor, but that has been used. And this is supposed to guide them through that, looking at the different ways in which, so that they can make an intelligent decision on who to appoint. We had conferences such as that one about the challenges in UK archaeological capacity. We realized there were things coming down the road, big infrastructure projects, and were there enough archaeologists to deal with them, and how were we going to deal with that when we didn't have very big organizations. We also had the big problem of archives piling up in our stores, and where and how could we actually give them to museums. And then obviously we carried on with health and safety audits. In 2013, we were challenged a little bit to give a talk at a CIFA conference on value. And that, at that meeting, Adrian and I presented a talk about how value is linked to what the people who are paying for it value it as. And we realized that there were problems in the marketplace, as most of us knew. And therefore we said, this is what we need to be aiming for as FAME. These series of different aspirations. Informed procurement, which is the guide I was just talking about. Better understanding for clients about what they were buying. Greater barriers to entry. Unfortunately, that's never been achieved. Although Barney was saying something positive about it today, Historic England still have accreditation. They have accreditation for architects and engineers, but not for archaeologists. So anybody can do work for Historic England, and they won't recommend any particular scheme. We do have the registered organisation scheme from CIFA, which is one step towards it anyway. Obviously, the partnership, working with clients, but also other parts of the sector. Standard method of measurement you've heard about. You can see how long these things have been running before we've actually achieved them. Innovation. Innovation we still need to do far more on, but there are things that are coming up, and our members have from time to time talked at this forum and at CIFA conferences about things they're doing in different ways and new technologies they're deploying. Malim, for example, talked last year here about the different approaches towards skeletal material and what you can draw out from that. Future-proofing, that is still a big issue. Planning ahead, understanding what challenges we're going to have to face, and how we can actually use other professions, other disciplines to learn from them and train ourselves and make ourselves more applicable to the time. And that also reflects on skills. There is a lot of in-house training going on because we can't necessarily buy in a lot of those skills. And obviously, if you have them in-house, you're bringing your money back into the house, into your own company, but also you're investing in the future. And perhaps the most important thing is this business about raising our profile. That if, as archaeologists, we see ourselves as professionals and should be paid a commensurate rate, then we need to be seen on a par with other professionals. That is easy when you're upstream in the planning process or the design process. You're sitting around a table with architects, with engineers, with the applicant. You can be valued at that stage, but that's largely consultants who do that. Obviously, when you have 20 people in the field in high vis digging holes and getting very muddy, they look like workmen. And that is very difficult then to convince those who are paying for it that they are professionals at the same rate as architects and engineers. Doesn't mean we don't do it, we have to do it somehow, but it's a difficult one. One of the main campaigns that we've launched at that time was about all these archives being held by our members illegally because we don't own them in our stores. So if anything happened to them, if they got broken into or burnt, if somebody said that, oh, look, that was my property and it was worth £20,000, we would be liable. And also our stores aren't environmentally secure stores. There are all sorts of other reasons that we don't necessarily need to store these. These archives ought to be going to museums or repositories. However, there was a huge lack of understanding amongst some of our colleagues about the number of obstacles there are in the way of trying to deposit an archive. And what exactly do we mean by an archive? And it largely comes down to the problem of material archive of artifacts called objects in law. And I've listed down here a series of bullet points about the problems that we've faced. However, over the same sort of period of time, we have progressed matters. The 21st Century Programme on Archaeology raised it as one of the issues to be discussed. And from that, a panel was formed under Historic England's leadership, which included Arts Council England and Collections Trust and Museums, Society of Museum Archaeologists, Gale, CIFA, several other bodies, not only to discuss our problem with archives, but it's a much wider range of things with the Mendoza report coming in as well. But out of that, there was also legal advice sought from a barrister, and 2 documents were produced, which are now out for consultation. One was a model deed of transfer, which is a document that basically says, I as landowner am, in principle, I'm donating my artifacts to X museum. And then as the project progresses and you produce a list of what is there, that then gets signed off, and you can do your selection and retention, and the retained articles go to the museum. But this is dependent on us knowing who the owner is. And we don't necessarily know who the landowner is when we're digging on their land. The applicant does, and therefore it's got to be started right at the early stage of the planning process by our archaeological advisors and the planning authorities to say to the applicant, you need to look at this. If the landowner wants to retain their objects, they're perfectly well entitled to do that. However, if they're happy for these bits of old pot and bits of animal bone to be deposited at a museum, we need you to sign this deed of transfer. And the second document was this, what's called a tort of conversion, which is it's really a guidance document, but the idea of that is that if you don't know who these objects belong to, then you can assert your own ownership over them by doing the kind of things that we normally do, which is to package them carefully, to label them up, doing things that you would do to your own property. By doing that, you're actually asserting ownership over them. And that can then be converted and sent to a museum. Unfortunately, at the moment, of course, museums, as we all know, are out of the planning process, so they don't have to take any of the archives at all. And secondly, only 30% of our museums are actually accepting any archives at the moment. None of the majority have no space left, or they don't have archaeological curators to take them on board. So we have a major problem with it, and it's not entirely resolved. However, it's on our website as well, this link that's up there. And I do urge you to download those documents and use them as much as you can, and especially try the conversion. Try and see if museums or other repositories, other stores, county stores or whatever, will take the archives based on that. And feedback to us, because we need to know. This is, as I say, at the moment it's under consultation until September. Health and safety, we've already been through this, so I don't necessarily need to run through this. Luke's talked about it, And it's obviously a primary aim of FAME, and it continues to be, working in as safe a way as possible. We have extended that health and safety to well-being, and there are mental health guidance that we've also issued. And there are other issues to do with well-being that we've addressed, some of which is in the bullet points here. Obviously, things like COVID came in, and it was very much through FAME leadership that we could have a consensus on how best to manage that and yet to carry on undertaking archaeological work. And then there's been a number of different documents produced, advice documents, and what we were calling Raising the Bar document with highways, national highways, which was born out of what Luke was talking about with the high-vis, the sort of fire-resistant high-vis PPE having to be worn in greenfield trial trenching. A ridiculous situation, and how on earth HSE allows tier one contractors to tell us what to do when we should be doing our own risk assessment. I don't understand, because it seems contrary to practice. But these are some examples of either the technical advice notes that we've been issuing on health and safety, or they are what we call alerts. So when an accident happens or a near miss happens, one of the members, they send in the details to Doug, and he puts it on the website and sends it around to membership. So pressurized pipes, explosions, for example, is one of those. Advocacy. That Build Back Better letter to the Prime Minister. Well, we'd had hope that something would come of that. I'm not sure much did. Adrian and Taryn were part of the APAG group when Riesdale and Renfrew were there. Again, I'm not quite sure what we really got out of that in the end, but certainly our side of the situation and concerns that we had were raised at the time. After Brexit, there was a problem about whether we were going to be able to have enough archaeologists to help deal with all the big infrastructure projects that we were dealing with. Doug worked very hard on making sure that we were included in the shortage occupation list. We've continued to liaise with the national agencies and other partners. We've liaised with health and safety over CDM. And then we've also been called in by both HS2 at a very early stage and Thames Tideway Tunnel and others to say, these big projects are coming up. Is archaeology as an industry going to be able to react and cope with this? Have we got capacity issues coming up? In terms of business support, clearly the state of the archaeological market survey, which Kenneth had just talked about, is one of the prime bits of information that we have to use, and I could talk about that a little bit more in a minute. The standard method of measurement you've already heard talked about yesterday and mentioned today. It's been renamed Principles of Good Practice in the Procurement of Archaeological Field Services or something like that. It is, again, it's a consultation document, really. We need people to work with it and see how effective it is, and if it's not effective, and how we need to change it. It's a dynamic document, really. The carbon calculator, again, we've had discussed today. This is, again, something that we will all benefit by, because the government is going to move that way. At present, many of us perhaps don't need to use it. It's only being used on the big infrastructure projects, but it will probably permeate to most other larger scale projects, and they will probably want the organization to know what its carbon footprint is, at least. We also issued the advice that we got, the legal advice that we got from after the Competition and Markets Authority was investigating various bits of anti-competitive behavior. We've contributed to the Syria best good practice guide, which Pete was talking about earlier. We've been sharing innovation, and we have a relationship with Quest for supplying all sorts of different documents, and also a phone-in service for advice for legal, employment, health and safety, and other things. Bye, Jim. So, in terms of measuring maturity in the business, I'm not going to talk about the graph. You've seen that already. Kenneth has shown it. It's the number of archaeologists working in commercial archaeology with a big dip there for the crash, the 2008 crash. So I just put together some ideas of perhaps how we can look at maturity. I'm not saying that this is prescriptive at all. I mean, other people come up with other measures, I think. But how much do we contribute to the UK economy? I think also looking at the longevity of many of our organisations shows that we're being sustainable. We've also got quite a lot of diversity. We've got very small projects, we've got startups, we've got medium-sized ones, we've got locally based ones, we've got national and international operators. So that is all beneficial. We have profit. Some make a good surplus and can reinvest that in their companies and in their staff. We need to encourage those that are not making surpluses to do so. We collaborate amongst ourselves to deliver the big infrastructure projects, and that's got to be a benefit. You know, look back to the 1990s, the situation post PPG 16, when there was all that mistrust of other companies or other competing organizations. I don't think we're in that same world now. I think we move well beyond it. So by doing things like that, we have the ability to meet the capacity challenges that are facing us. Hopefully, thinking about Tarek's talk earlier, we have some kind of some kind of understanding of contract and contract terminology. And again, the State of the Archaeological Market Survey would certainly say, you know, there's a lot of us use contracts. There's only about 5% that do not use contracts at all. Whether we understand them, whether we can get caught out is another matter, but we need to keep that in mind. And obviously we need to always be considering risk management, financial risk management, so that our companies continue to flourish. There have been, I think, although there have been some failures, there have been surprisingly few. And the safe working environment we always need to maintain. So I'm not going to dwell on this. You heard it already from Kenneth. Almost 5,000 archaeologists employed in commercial practice. As I say, it was 3,500 in 2008. That's a big growth over the last 17 years, and it was 1,500 in 1998. 337 million pounds revenue. That sounds to me like a mature industry. That's contributing to the national economy. 59% of that comes from house building and 13% from energy. 68,544 pounds per annum is the average turnover per archaeologist, the charge out rate per archaeologist. 2.5% profit. That's it's not high enough, I don't think. It's an average, of course, so it doesn't really mean a great deal, because we know there are quite a lot of loss-making organisations still. But when you compare, if you say that archaeology is part of construction, and you compare that 2.5% profit against the profit for last year in the construction industry as a whole, which was 1.7%, is the lowest in the world, then we're not doing too badly. So I think some of these bullet points here are saying that, yes, we probably have matured. We have members who have over 50 years history. That surely means they're sustainable. We've weathered various shocks. The 1990s recession, 2008 one, the Brexit, and COVID. And 89% of the funding was from the private sector last year. So we're completely independent of government funds. And that means that we can do what we like. We're not, unfortunately, you know, the people who are employed in public service are beholden to the changes that happen either at local or national government level. And if there are sudden needs to make reductions, we tend to be top of the list for getting rid of people. So you're actually having your money from a private source makes us probably safer than those who are employed by the public sector. The number of mergers and acquisitions that have gone on also suggests that we have a mature industry. The growth in consultants, the fact that a lot of these consultancy companies realize they need archaeologists on their staff, also shows that people are taking this discipline seriously, and they need them to ensure that their clients and the planning process are serviced appropriately. And yet we still have startup companies coming through. So we've got the very big ones, and we've got medium-sized ones, and we've got very small ones. And the very small ones can grow very fast, like Magnitude, for example. So we have the margins on the financial side that have improved, and therefore we can reinvest. But we still have a problem in that there is a large number of our members who are not making enough on that front. They're not putting up their charges. They're perhaps not understanding the basic costs that they are facing. We've also got investment in staff training, partly because we've got to, because we have no alternative. One of the things that we asked a few years ago is what the membership saw as being the big challenges. Future-proofing was seen as a big challenge, and part of that is succession planning, career development. We need to have an industry in which people know that if they're joining as a graduate, there is a way in which they're going to move upwards over time. And this is taken from obviously the recent benchmarking that CIFA did on salaries. And if you look at that, you can see where the anomaly lies. It's not necessarily at the start of a career, nor indeed at what you might say are the associate level, the midterm. It's at the manager level. We are well below what the rest of our benchmarking partners are paying. Now that suggests that we are not planning effectively for career development. This again, you've probably heard before. It's this old business of, I can't remember if it was Taryn who first put it this way, but anyway, if you look at it in a binary way, we tend to find that we are a commodity service model. In other words, quantity. We do things cheaply, we do a lot of it. But we really want to be a value-added service. We want to be able to show the clients that it is much more than just digging holes in the ground that we do. And we can give them perhaps all that public benefit that Barney was talking about, allow them to fulfill their corporate social responsibilities if that's what they want to do, or just on a local level, good PR for the population around where the development is happening. In order for us to justify the kind of charges that we want to charge the clients, we have to make them understand us and to value us. And we need to make those surpluses so that we can reinvest in the business, we can upskill our staff, and we can innovate, do some research and innovation. So we need to move towards a way in which we can enhance value and prove to our clients that we are valuable contributors to what they're trying to do, to the project that they're trying to deliver. Thank you. That should be the end, if I can get back to it. Stuck now. Next. Nope. Anyway, that's the end of the talk.